What is the ultimate revenge? Is it wealth? Is it fame? Or is it showing the person who threw you away that they weren't just discarding a partner, but overlooking a titan? In tonight's story, we dive into a world of glamour, betrayal, and the shattering illusion of success. A self-satisfied millionaire, Richard Sterling thinks he has it all, a new, younger fiancée on his arm, and the envy of his peers. But he's about to learn a brutal lesson when his past walks back into his life, not with a whimper, but with a thunderclap that will bring his perfectly curated world crashing down around him. Stay tuned. The Air in the Celestial Club, a private rooftop bar overlooking the glittering sprawl of Manhattan, was thick with the scent of money. It was a heady perfume of expensive leather vintage scotch, and the self-assured fragrance worn by men and women who never had to look at a price tag. Richard Sterling breathed it in like oxygen. At 42, he was a king in this particular jungle, a self-made millionaire in the cutthroat world of private equity. He wasn't owed money, but he'd made enough new money to plate his life in a convincing facsimile of gold. Tonight was his coronation. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler, the ice clinking a gentle, rhythmic applause to his success. His friends, or rather the collection of associates, rivals, and sycophants he called friends, were gathered around him. There was Marcus Thorne, a hedge fund manager with a predatory smile, and David Chen, a tech investor who spoke in valuations and exit strategies. To Richard, Marcus toasted, raising his glass, finally closing the chapter on the starter marriage and moving on to the collector's edition. A wave of knowing chuckles rippled through the group. Richard's lips curled into a smug smile. He glanced at the woman tucked under his arm, Faye Hayes. She was 25, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes the shade of a Caribbean sea. She was a model, an influencer, an aspiring actress, a perfect trinity of modern ambition. More importantly, she was a living, breathing testament to his status. She was his upgrade. "She's a work of art, Sterling," David commented, his eyes doing a quick, appreciative scan of Faye. "A masterpiece. Only the best, David. You know my motto, acquire, improve, or divest," Richard said, his voice a low, confident boom. He gave Faye's waist a proprietary squeeze. She giggled, a musical sound that was perfectly rehearsed. She knew her role in this ecosystem. She was to be beautiful, adoring, and blissfully unaware of the subtle barbs aimed at the woman who came before her, his ex-wife, Isla. The thought of her was like a distant, faded photograph. Isla Vance, the woman he'd married when he was still just a hungry analyst with more ambition than capital. She had been sensible, grounded. She'd managed their first tiny apartment, celebrated his first big bonus with a home-cooked meal, and believed in him when his own self-belief was just borrowed bravado. She was the foundation upon which he had built his empire. And like all foundations, she was meant to remain unseen, buried beneath the gleaming structure he now inhabited. Their divorce had been civil on the surface, but Richard knew the truth. He had outgrown her. While he was learning to navigate boardrooms and yacht parties, she was talking about starting a small, sustainable textile business. While he was acquiring companies, she was looking at looms. It was quaint, pathetic, really. He needed a woman who reflected his station, not one who reminded him of his humble beginnings. "I heard Isla still puttering around with that little fabric hobby of hers," Marcus said, leaning in conspiratorially. "My wife saw her at some farmer's market in Brooklyn, of all places, selling scarves or something." Richard scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. "Let her. It keeps her busy. Some people are just meant for the minor leagues. It's a shame, but what can you do? I sent her a generous settlement, more than enough to fund a lifetime of knitting circles. He felt a surge of validation. Here he was in the penthouse of New York society, while she was peddling handicrafts in a borough he hadn't set foot in for years. He had won. The divorce was the ultimate divestment, and Faye was the ultimate acquisition. Well, tonight's about the future, Richard declared, raising his glass higher. To my beautiful fiancée Faye, the woman who understands what it means to reach for the stars. Faye beamed, her smile as bright as the diamond on her finger, a 10-carat rock he had delighted in telling everyone was triple the size of Isla's old ring. As the group drank to his toast, Richard felt an intoxicating sense of triumph. He scanned the room, his kingdom. The dark wood paneling, the soft jazz trio in the corner, the panoramic view of a city that lay at his feet. Everything was perfect. Everything was in its place. It was then that the grand double doors at the entrance of the club swung silently open. A change rippled through the room. It wasn't loud or sudden, but a subtle shift in atmospheric pressure, the way the air stills before a storm. Conversations lulled, heads turned. The jazz trio seemed to lose its rhythm for a beat. Richard followed the collective gaze, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. Who had the audacity to command such attention to steal his spotlight? And then he saw her. It was Isla, but it wasn't the Isla from the farmer's market of his imagination. It wasn't the sensible, quiet woman in practical shoes and a cardigan. The woman standing in the doorway was a vision. She wore a simple, impeccably tailored gown of emerald silk that clung to her form, a color that made her dark hair and fair skin seem luminous. Her only jewelry was a pair of delicate diamond earrings that caught the light, and a newfound confidence that radiated from her like a physical force. She looked taller, not in height, but in presence. She carried herself with an elegant, unbothered grace that made every other woman in the room, including Faye, suddenly look overdone. Richard's glass stopped halfway to his lips. His heart gave a hard, painful thud against his ribs. It was a disorienting mix of shock and a primal, unwelcome tug of attraction. This was not the woman he had divorced. This was someone else entirely. But the real shock, the blow that truly knocked the air from his lungs, was not Isla herself. It was the man whose hand she was holding. He wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a politician. To most of the world, he was all but invisible, which in this world made him the most powerful man of all. He was Julian Croft. If Richard Sterling was a king, Julian Croft was a deity, a recluse, a legend, a true billionaire, not a mere millionaire who played at being rich. His wealth wasn't in flashy assets. It was in foundational technology, in controlling interests, in global logistics, in patents that would shape the next century. He was whispered about in the highest echelons of finance, a ghost who moved markets with a single phone call. He never attended these events. He never posed for pictures. His privacy was his ultimate luxury. And he was holding Isla's hand. Not formally, not a polite escort's grip. Their fingers were intertwined, a gesture of casual, profound intimacy that spoke volumes. He leaned down and murmured something in her ear, and her lips, the same lips that once whispered encouragement to a young Richard Sterling, curved into a genuine, radiant smile. The sound in Richard's ears was like a roaring vacuum. The smug satisfaction, the triumph, the carefully constructed reality of his perfect life, it all shattered in an instant. Marcus's jaw was slack. David Chen looked like he had seen a ghost. and Faye beside him had gone rigid, her painted smile frozen in place. In that moment, Richard Sterling understood. He wasn't the king of the jungle. He had been playing in a gilded cage all along, and the door had just been blown off its hinges. His ex-wife, the starter wife he had pitied and discarded, hadn't just walked in. She had arrived, and she had brought the man who owned the world with her. The silence that had fallen over Richard's table was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The clinking of ice in his own glass just moments ago, a sound of triumph, now seemed to mock him with its frivolity. His mind, usually a sharp and decisive instrument, was a chaotic mess of denial, rage, and a deep, humiliating confusion. "It's a mistake," was his first thought. "A coincidence. She's his lawyer, his caterer, anything but that." But the way Julian Croft looked at Isla dispelled any such notion. It was a look of quiet admiration, of deep-seated affection. He wasn't looking at a subordinate, he was looking at an equal. As they moved further into the room, a path seemed to magically clear for them. The club's owner, a man who usually treated Richard with a fawning deference, hurried over to greet them personally, his smile genuine and respectful in a way it never was for Richard. "Mr. Croft, what an unexpected honor. And Ms. Vance, you look absolutely stunning," the owner gushed. Ms. Vance, not Mrs. Sterling, the name she had so eagerly taken, and the name he had assumed she clung to like a piece of wreckage from their shared life. He realized with a jolt that he hadn't thought of her as Isla Vance in over a decade. In his mind, she was permanently, irrevocably his ex. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice a hoarse whisper. Is that the Julian Croft? The man who bought out Omnicorp with pocket change?" "It can't be," David muttered, but his eyes, wide with disbelief, told a different story. Faye finally broke her frozen state. She turned to Richard, her voice a sharp, high-pitched query. "Richie, who is that? Who is she with?" There was a new unsettling note in her tone. The adoring gaze was gone, replaced by a calculating curiosity. She was recalibrating, assessing the new power dynamic that had just detonated in the room. Richard couldn't answer. His throat was tight. He watched as Julian guided Isla to a secluded booth in the corner, a prime spot that was always reserved, and one Richard himself had never been offered. He saw Julian help her with her chair, a simple act of courtesy that felt more profound than any of Richard's grand, ostentatious gestures. He felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. The story about Isla at the farmer's market, his own condescending pity, it all felt like a pathetic joke now, and he was the punchline. He had been bragging about his 10-carat diamond, while she was holding hands with a man who could buy the entire diamond mine. "I need a drink," Richard said, his voice raw. He threw back the rest of his scotch, the burn doing nothing to quell the fire in his gut. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit here exposed and humiliated in front of his friends. He had to regain control of the narrative. Pushing his chair back abruptly, he stood up. "Richie, what are you doing?" Faye asked, her hand flying to his arm. "I'm going to go say hello," he said, forcing a casualness into his voice that he did not feel. It's the polite thing to do. As he walked across the room, he could feel every eye on him. The short distance to their booth felt like a mile-long walk of shame. He formulated a plan in his head. He'd be cool, magnanimous, the bigger man. He'd congratulate her, make a joke, show everyone that this didn't affect him in the slightest. He reached the booth. "Isla," he said, his voice coming out a little too loud. She looked up, her eyes a warm hazel he had once known so well, were calm. There was no anger in them, no triumph, just a cool, placid recognition. It was that placidity that unnerved him more than anything. "Richard," she acknowledged, her tone even. Julian Croft's gaze flickered towards him. It was an unnervingly perceptive gaze, as if he could see straight through Richard's bravado to the panicked insecurity beneath. "Fancy seeing you here," Richard continued, gesturing vaguely around the opulent room. "Didn't think this was your kind of scene anymore." It was a subtle dig, a reminder of her quaint hobbies. Isla's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "My tastes have evolved." "Clearly," Richard said, unable to stop his eyes from flicking to Julian. He extended a hand, the picture of forced corporate friendliness. "Richard Sterling, I don't think we've been formally introduced." Julian took his hand. His grip was firm, relaxed, and utterly confident. "Julian Croft." He didn't offer any more information. He didn't need to. "Richard and I used to be married," Isla supplied, her voice smooth as silk. The statement hung in the air, simple, factual, and devastatingly effective. It redefined him in that moment, not as a master of the universe, but as her past. "Well," Richard stammered, his scriptless, "this is quite the surprise, the two of you." "Why would it be a surprise, Richard?" Isla asked, a genuine curiosity in her question that was sharper than any barb. "Did you assume I'd simply vanish?" Before he could formulate a response, Julian spoke for the first time, his voice a low, calm baritone that commanded attention without having to raise its volume. "Isla is a remarkable woman. The world is starting to recognize that. I'm just fortunate enough to be ahead of the curve." He then turned, his full attention back to Isla, effectively dismissing Richard as if he were a waiter who had overstayed his welcome. The dismissal was so complete, so effortless, that Richard was left standing there, speechless and obsolete. He had come over to assert his dominance and had been rendered utterly irrelevant in less than a minute. He retreated back to his table, his face a mask of thunder. "What happened? What did they say?" Marcus pressed, leaning forward eagerly. Richard sank into his chair. "Nothing, we just caught up." But his friends weren't fools. They had seen the exchange. They saw the way Julian Croft had dismissed him. They saw the cool confidence in Isla. The power dynamic at the table had irrevocably shifted. The fawning admiration for Richard was gone, replaced by a feverish, gossipy interest in his ex-wife. "I can't believe it. Julian Croft," David kept muttering, pulling out his phone, no doubt to text everyone he knew. "How did she manage that? I mean, she was always so plain." The word hung in the air. Plain. It was the word Richard himself had used to describe her. And it was a lie. He saw that now. Isla wasn't plain. He had just lacked the eyes to see her color. He had been so blinded by his own reflection that he'd missed the masterpiece standing beside him. Then came the twist that turned the knife. A man Richard recognized as Liam Hemsworth, the actor, approached Isla and Julian's table. There were handshakes, warm smiles. Richard strained to hear their conversation over the din. "Heard the news, Julian," Liam was saying. "Congratulations on the partnership. Vance. It's all anyone in LA is talking about. Sustainable, ethical, and revolutionary. You backed a real winner." Julian smiled. "I didn't back it. Isla built it. I'm just an investor. She's the visionary." Isla's face lit up with a pride that Richard had never seen before. "Liam, thank you. We're hoping to change the way the industry thinks about materials." Vance. The name of her company, her own name. Not some cutesy homespun brand, a real company. The hobby he had mocked, the little fabric thing, was being discussed by movie stars and funded by billionaires. The blood drained from Richard's face. He felt a profound, sickening sense of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He had not just misjudged the woman, he had catastrophically misunderstood her ambition. He thought her world was small because he had tried to keep it that way. But it had grown silently powerfully and was now poised to eclipse his own. Faye, who had been watching him intently, finally spoke, her voice devoid of its usual sweetness. Her company. What company? Richard couldn't look at her. He just stared at his drink, at the melting ice in the bottom of his glass, a perfect metaphor for his dissolving reality. The king had been dethroned in his own court, and the woman he had cast aside was wearing the crown. The drive home to his sterile, minimalist penthouse in Richard's gleaming German sports car was an exercise in oppressive silence. Faye sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the blurred city lights, her usual stream of chatter dammed by a wall of sullen contemplation. The 10-carat diamond on her finger seemed to have lost some of its luster under the harsh glow of the streetlights. When they finally arrived, she didn't wait for him to open her door. She strode into the apartment, her heels clicking an angry staccato on the polished marble floors. She threw her clutch onto a white leather sofa and spun to face him, her arms crossed. "You lied to me, Richard." "I didn't lie," he said, loosening his tie, feeling like it was strangling him. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Her voice was sharp, accusatory. "You told me she was nothing, a sad little divorcee living off your money-making scarves in her lonely apartment. You painted this picture of a pathetic woman you'd outgrown, someone to be pitied." She took a step closer, her eyes flashing. That woman back there was not pathetic. The way Julian Croft looked at her, the way everyone in that room looked at her, that wasn't pity, Richard. That was respect. And you told me her little hobby was a joke. It turns out her joke is a company big enough to get investment from one of the richest men in the world. How was I supposed to know? He snapped, his own frustration boiling over. It was a little hobby. She was talking about organic dyes and hand-weaving techniques. It was nonsense. Was it, Richard? Faye shot back. Or were you just not listening? The question struck him with the force of a physical blow, because he knew in a dark, shuttered corner of his soul that it was the truth. He hadn't listened. As Faye continued her tirade, her voice faded into a dull buzz in Richard's ears. He was no longer in his multi-million-dollar penthouse. He was adrift in the canyon of his memory, the echoes of his past, with Ela swirling around him. He remembered a dinner, maybe 8 years ago. He had just closed a major deal, a hostile takeover that had earned him a 7-figure bonus and a reputation for being ruthless. He came home drunk on victory and expensive wine to find the dining table covered not with food, but with swatches of fabric in earthy tones of indigo rust and saffron. Isla's face was smudged with dye, her eyes bright with an excitement he hadn't seen in years. "Richie, look," she'd said, her voice alive with passion. "I did it. I finally perfected the process. It's a textile made from a blend of recycled silk and bamboo fiber. It's as strong as canvas, but feels like cashmere. And these colors, all derived from vegetable waste, onion skins, avocado pits. It's completely sustainable. No chemical runoff, no environmental impact." He had stared at the fabrics blankly, his mind still buzzing with spreadsheets and market caps. "That's nice, honey," he'd said, his tone dismissive. He dropped his briefcase on the floor. "Can we clear this stuff off? I'm starving and I want to celebrate. Call up Le Bernardin and see if they can squeeze us in." The light in her eyes had dimmed. "Oh, okay, I just thought this could be something. A real business. I've even drawn up a preliminary business plan. Vance Textiles." He had laughed then, not a cruel laugh, but a patronizing one, the laugh of a husband indulging his wife's cute little project. A business sweetheart that's adorable. But let's be realistic. You're going to compete with giant manufacturing plants in Asia with onion skins stick to decorating the house. I'll handle the business side of things in this family. He had tossed her business plan, a folder she had clearly spent weeks on, onto a side table without even opening it. He never looked at it again. That night, he had taken her to Le Bernardin, bought her champagne, and talked endlessly about his own triumph, never noticing the silence that had settled over her, a silence that, in retrospect, had never truly lifted. Another memory surfaced. Ela, a few years later, showing him an article in a niche design magazine about the rise of ethical fashion. "See," she'd said, a quiet desperation in her voice. "The world is changing. People are starting to care where their products come from. This is the future, Richard." He had glanced at the magazine and scoffed. "The future is technology and scalability, Ela, not a handful of hippies willing to pay a fortune for an ugly burlap sack. It's a fad. Focus on planning the charity gala. That's important for my image." He had actively, repeatedly steered her away from her ambition and toward the role he had assigned her, the supportive, socialite wife. He hadn't just been ignorant of her potential, he had been the primary obstacle to it. He saw her passion not as something to be nurtured, but as a distraction from her duties as Mrs. Sterling. And Julian Croft, how had she met him? Richard pictured a glamorous party, a chance encounter, but his gut told him that was his own fantasy, his own limited worldview. The truth was likely far more impressive and far more humiliating for him. He was right. Ela had not met Julian at a party. After the divorce, armed with a settlement that Richard had considered a generous golden parachute, Ela had done the one thing he never expected. She invested it all in herself. She leased a small workshop in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, bought 2 state-of-the-art looms, and hired a textile engineer who had just graduated from Pratt. For 2 years, she worked relentlessly, refining her product, building a supply chain, and operating in near-total obscurity. She got her first break not at a farmer's market, but at a high-level symposium on sustainable technology. She had paid the exorbitant entry fee with the last of her capital, securing a tiny 10-by-10-foot booth in the back of the hall, surrounded by billion-dollar tech corporations. For 2 days, she was mostly ignored. Then, on the final afternoon, a man in a simple gray suit, without an entourage or name badge, stopped at her booth. He didn't glance at her products, he studied them. He picked up a swatch of her bamboo silk fabric, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. He read her technical specifications, his eyes scanning the data on tensile strength and dye composition. "This is remarkable," he'd said, finally, his voice quiet. "The carbon footprint is virtually zero, yet the quality is higher than fabrics produced with 1,000 times the environmental cost. How did you solve the fiber consistency problem?" It was Julian Croft. He hadn't been drawn by flash or marketing. He had been drawn by the data, by the brilliance of the solution. They talked for 2 hours, not about money or fame, but about process innovation and ethical imperatives. He saw the genius in what she had created, the very thing Richard had dismissed as nonsense. By the end of the week, his venture capital firm had signed a letter of intent to provide seed funding. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a shrewd business decision. The romance, Ela would later admit to a friend, came after born from a meeting of minds, a shared passion for building something meaningful. Julian wasn't attracted to the woman Richard had divorced. He was attracted to the woman she had become in spite of him. Back in the penthouse, Faye's voice finally cut through Richard's reverie. "And you just stood there, looking like a fool. Do you have any idea how this makes me look?" Richard looked at her, then truly looked at her. He saw her for what she was: beautiful, ambitious, and utterly transactional. He had chosen her because she was a reflection of his own superficial values. And now that reflection was showing him a distorted, ugly version of himself. He had thought Faye was his masterpiece, his upgrade. But he was starting to realize she was just a mirror, and he didn't like what he was seeing. His world wasn't just unraveling because of Ila's success. It was unraveling because her success held up a giant, merciless mirror to his own profound failure, not as a businessman, but as a man. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had discarded a fortune and hadn't even been smart enough to know it. In the days that followed the disastrous night at the Celestial Club, Richard Sterling's world began to shrink. The incident became the premier piece of gossip in their elite circle. David Chen's texts had clearly made the rounds. When Richard walked into a boardroom, the pre-meeting chatter would suddenly die down. He'd catch the whispers, the sideways glances. His power, once absolute in his sphere, was now being questioned. He was no longer the man to be envied. He was the man who'd made the biggest blunder in social and romantic history. His calls to Marcus Thorne, once a reliable well of gossip and flattery, were now met with a cool professionalism. The invitations to exclusive poker nights and weekend golf trips dried up. He was becoming a liability, a walking punchline. The worst part was the coverage. Vance Textiles was suddenly everywhere. Forbes ran a feature, "The Phoenix of Fabric, How Ila Vance is Weaving the Future of Fashion." Vogue Business did a deep dive into her supply chain. Her face, serene and confident, was on magazine covers and business websites, and often Julian Croft was mentioned not as her savior, but as her strategic partner. Richard became obsessed. He spent his nights scrolling through articles about her, his stomach twisting with a toxic cocktail of jealousy, regret, and pure, unadulterated rage. He saw photos of her and Julian at gallery openings, at tech conferences, looking every bit the power couple. He, Richard Sterling, had been relegated to a footnote in her story. The foolish ex-husband. His relationship with Faye was fracturing under the strain. She had become distant, her phone always in her hand, her expression a mixture of boredom and resentment. She started making comments, sharp little digs that hit him where it hurt most. "I saw Ila's company is opening a flagship store in Soho," she said one morning over breakfast, not looking up from her phone. "Must be nice to have a billionaire boyfriend to pay for it." "He's an investor, not her piggy bank," Richard snapped. "It's a business." "Whatever," she scoffed. "All I know is that my agent called yesterday. A casting director who was interested in me for a commercial suddenly thinks I'm not the right fit. It's because of you, Richard. You're yesterday's news, and I'm being dragged down with you." Her words were cruel, but they struck a nerve of truth. His social currency was plummeting, and Faye, whose entire career was built on association and image, was panicking. The breaking point came a week later. Richard was in a meeting with a group of potential investors from Singapore for a new fund he was launching. It was a critical deal, the one he needed to reassert his dominance. Everything was going well. He was in his element, charming and persuasive, throwing around figures and projections. Then one of the investors, a stern-faced man named Mr. Lim, paused. "Mr. Sterling, your projections are impressive, but our due diligence team has raised a concern about your judgment." Richard stiffened. "My judgment? My track record speaks for itself." Mr. Lim offered a thin, unapologetic smile. "Indeed. But we have also been reading about Vance Textiles, a truly revolutionary enterprise. We understand your ex-wife is the founder. You were married to her during the initial development phase of her core technology, yet you passed on the opportunity to be her seed investor. An opportunity that a man like Julian Croft seized immediately." He leaned forward slightly. "Our concern is simple. If you could not see the billion-dollar potential in your own house, how can we be confident that you can see it for us in the market?" The room went cold. It was the ultimate indictment. His greatest personal failure was now infecting his professional life. It was a direct attack on the very core of his identity, his ability to spot value. He mumbled some excuse about a conflict of interest, but the damage was done. The air of doubt was palpable. The deal wasn't dead, but it was on life support. He left the meeting in a cold fury. Humiliation had curdled into a dark, viscous need for revenge. He couldn't stand by and watch her rise on the ashes of his reputation. If he couldn't be the hero of the story anymore, he would become the villain. He would tear her down. His first move was to call his private investigator, a former NYPD detective named Sal, who operated in the city's gray areas. "Sal, it's Richard Sterling," he said, his voice low and tight. "I need you to dig into Isla Vance's company, Vance Textiles. I want everything: supply chains, employee records, financials. Find a weakness. A disgruntled employee, a supplier. She cut corners with a permit she forgot to file. I don't care how small. Find me some dirt." His next call was to a notorious financial blogger, a man known as the Vulture, who ran a muckraking website that could move stock prices with a single negative post. Richard had fed him tips before, to his own benefit. "I have a story for you," Richard said, "about the market's new darling Vance Textiles. It seems their ethical image might not be as clean as it looks." For the next 2 weeks, Richard orchestrated a covert war. Sal's digging turned up a minor issue. A supplier in Peru had been briefly cited for a water usage violation 6 months ago. It was a clerical error that had been rectified immediately, but in Richard's hands, it was a weapon. He fed this information, twisted and amplified, to the Vulture. The resulting blog post was a masterpiece of insinuation and character assassination. The headline screamed, "Vance's virtue signal is ethical, textile giant exploiting South American resources." The article painted Ela not as an innovator, but as a hypocrite, using a carefully selected photo of her from the gala, making her look decadent and out of touch. Simultaneously, Richard used his own network. He called contacts at a major fashion conglomerate he knew was threatened by Vance's rise. He hinted that Vance's proprietary fiber blend wasn't as durable as claimed, suggesting they independently run tests that were designed to fail. He whispered to bankers that Julian Croft's investment was a vanity project, and that the company was burning through cash with no clear path to profitability. He was building a counter-narrative, a web of lies and half-truths designed to poison her reputation and spook her investors. It was a dirty, underhanded campaign, but Richard felt a grim satisfaction. He was back in control. He was no longer the victim. He was the puppet master, pulling the strings from the shadows. He was so consumed by his campaign of sabotage that he didn't notice Faye packing a suitcase until he found her standing by the door of the penthouse, 2 designer bags at her feet. "Where are you going?" he asked, a sense of dread dawning on him. I'm going to stay with my sister in LA for a while, she said, her voice flat. She wouldn't meet his eye. For how long? She finally looked at him, and there was no anger in her eyes anymore, just a cool, clinical pity. Don't call me Richard. I'll call you. He knew what that meant. It wasn't a temporary break. It was an exit. She had seen the way the wind was blowing and was jumping ship before it sank. The ultimate acquisition was divesting herself. It's because of her, isn't it? He said, the words tasting like acid. No, Faye said, shaking her head. It's because of you. I saw the article from that Vulture blog. Marcus told me what you've been doing, the rumors you've been spreading. I might be a lot of things, Richard, but I'm not with a man who's so pathetic he has to destroy his ex-wife to feel powerful. She opened the door. The man I thought you were would have moved on and built something bigger and better, but you're just small, and I don't do small. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing in the vast, empty apartment. Richard stood there alone, surrounded by the trappings of a success that now felt hollow. He had launched his empire, but in doing so, he had lost his fiancée, his friends, and the last vestiges of his own self-respect. And he was about to find out that the war he had started was one he was woefully unprepared to win. The invitation, printed on thick pearl-white cardstock, arrived in a sleek black courier envelope that felt more like a subpoena than a request for his company. It was for the annual Innovator of the Year awards at Lincoln Center, the glittering apex of the tech and business social calendar. In previous years, Richard's attendance was a given. He'd command a prime table, basking in the glow of influence. This year, the invitation was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down on expensive paper. The keynote address and the evening's highest honor, Innovator of the Year, was to be awarded to Isla Vance. His first instinct was to burn it, to pretend it never arrived. But cowardice was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not showing up would be a white flag, a public admission that she had broken him. No, he had to go. He would don the armor of his bespoke Tom Ford suit, fix a mask of bored amusement to his face, and watch her speech as if it were a mildly interesting but ultimately irrelevant piece of theater. He still clung to the belief that his smear campaign was working. Vance's stock, after its small initial public offering, had taken a 6% hit following the Vulture's article. He'd heard whispers from his contacts at rival banks that a couple of second-tier investors were getting nervous. He imagined these as pinpricks of doubt, slowly deflating the magnificent balloon of her success. He had wounded her, he told himself. Tonight, he wanted a front-row seat to watch her stumble. He pictured her voice wavering at the podium, her confidence cracked by the shadows he had cast. He arrived at the venue alone. The soaring glass-walled atrium was already teeming with the city's elite, a sea of black ties and designer gowns. The air buzzed with power. But as he stepped inside, the familiar atmosphere felt different. The friendly waves and backslapping greetings he once took for granted were replaced by something colder, more formal. He saw Marcus Thorne across the room. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before Marcus turned away, suddenly engrossed in conversation. David Chen gave him a curt nod that was more of a dismissal than a greeting. The cold shoulders were like physical blows. He was an infection, and no one wanted to risk contamination. Undeterred or pretending to be, he made his way to the bar. It was there he saw her. Isla was standing in the center of a circle of influence that included a senior senator, the CEO of a German automotive giant, and a celebrated artist. Julian Croft was by her side, a quiet anchor in the storm of her success. She was wearing a simple, floor-length gown of midnight blue that seemed to absorb the light, making her glow from within. She wasn't just composed, she was magnetic. People weren't just talking to her, they were listening, leaning in, captivated, and Richard, standing 20 yards away, had never felt more invisible. The awards ceremony began. Richard sat at his half-empty table, a grim testament to his new social status. He sipped his water, applauded mechanically for the minor award winners, and waited. Finally, the host, a renowned journalist with a silver mane and a voice like worn leather, stepped up to the main podium. Our final award tonight, the Innovator of the Year, is for more than just a successful quarter or a clever product. The host began, his voice filling the cavernous hall. It goes to an individual who has not only disrupted an industry, but has sought to redefine its very soul. Her work, Advanced Textiles, has set a new, unassailable standard for sustainability ethics and sheer breathtaking design. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Isla Vance. The room exploded in a sustained, thunderous wave of applause. Richard forced his hands together, the repetitive slap of his own skin, a hollow alien sound in the roar. Isla walked to the stage with an unhurried, liquid grace. She didn't look nervous. She looked like she belonged there. She reached the podium, took a moment, and a genuine warm smile spread across her face, lighting up the massive screens on either side of the stage. "Thank you," she began, her voice clear, steady, and resonant. "To be recognized for innovation is the greatest honor I can imagine. Because innovation at its core is about seeing what isn't there and asking, why not? It's about looking at a broken system and truly believing that you can build a better one." She spoke beautifully about her journey, her initial inspiration, her belief in a world where business could be a force for good. It was eloquent, inspiring, perfectly calibrated. Richard felt a flicker of smug satisfaction. She's taking the high road, he thought, ignoring the controversy. A classic, weak PR move. And then, just as he was settling into his cynical comfort, her tone shifted. The warmth remained, but it was now underpinned by a core of pure steel. "But innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum," she said, her eyes sweeping across the audience, and for a heart-stopping moment, they seemed to lock directly onto his. "It is often met with resistance, not just from the market, but from the inertia of old ideas, and sometimes from a place of fear, a place of malice." A profound hush fell over the room. You could hear the clink of a fork 100 tables away. Richard's heart began a low, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. "Here we go. In recent weeks," Isla continued, her voice as calm and implacable as a rising tide, "my company has been the subject of a series of targeted, anonymous attacks. Allegations have been made, designed to undermine our credibility and instill doubt in our partners, our investors, and our customers. These attacks were built on a foundation of twisted truths and, in some cases, outright fabrications." He could feel the heat in the room rising, the collective intake of breath. This was no longer an awards speech, it was a public execution. The anonymous sources claimed, for instance, that a Vance supplier in Peru was exploiting local water resources, she said. What these sources failed to mention was that the citation they referenced was for a minor clerical error, which was rectified within 24 hours. They also failed to mention this. The massive screen behind her lit up. It wasn't a static photo. It was a short, professionally shot video. A man in his 60s, with a kind, weathered face, appeared speaking in Spanish, with English subtitles. The caption identified him as the mayor of the Peruvian town. Vance Textiles is not a corporation that takes, the mayor said, his voice thick with emotion. They are a partner that gives. After the citation, they didn't just pay a fine. They co-funded a state-of-the-art water purification facility for our entire community. My people have clean drinking water for the first time in a generation because of Isla Vance. The video ended with a sweeping drone shot of the gleaming new facility. A wave of stunned murmurs rippled through the audience. Richard felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. They also whispered that our proprietary fiber blend was weak, that it couldn't stand up to industrial use. Isla went on, relentless. We thought that was a fair question, so we sent our fabric to the top materials science lab at MIT for independent stress testing. I could show you the data charts, but I think a quote from the lead scientist, Dr. Aris Thorne, might be more effective. The screen changed now, showing a quote in large, bold letters. The Vance V10 fiber is without exaggeration a miracle of material science. In our tests, it outperformed Kevlar for tensile strength at a fraction of the weight and showed zero degradation after 5,000 hours of UV and abrasion testing. It is simply put the future. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. Aris Thorne, that was Marcus Thorne's cousin, a man Marcus had sworn was on their side. The betrayal was dizzying. These attacks were designed to look like journalism, Isla said, her voice now carrying a cold, hard edge of righteous fury. But they were not. They were a coordinated campaign of industrial sabotage orchestrated by a single cowardly source. A source who attempted to poison our company from the shadows because he lacked the courage to face us, or perhaps himself, in the light. He could feel the eyes now, hundreds of pairs of them, turning towards him like heliotropes to a dying sun. He was the only person in that room with the motive. Everyone knew his story. Everyone knew he was the foolish ex-husband. He wanted to shrink, to disappear, but he was pinned in place by the weight of their collective gaze. Isla paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the accusation hang in the air and solidify. There is an old saying, people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. I've learned this is especially true when your opponent's house is made of bulletproof glass and your own is built on a foundation of sand. Then she delivered the final devastating blow, the coup de grace. The source of these attacks believed he was acting with perfect anonymity. He hid behind encrypted emails and shell accounts, but in a world of digital forensics and immutable ledgers, true anonymity is an illusion for amateurs. The screen behind her changed one last time. It displayed a complex but terrifyingly clear flowchart. At the very bottom was the logo of the Vulture's blog. Arrows pointed up from it to various nodes, shell companies, offshore accounts, a known private investigator named Sal. It was a map of Richard's entire conspiracy, and at the very, very top, a single line fed into the entire network. It was a screenshot of an encrypted email sent to the Vulture, and circled in glowing, unforgiving red at the top of the screenshot was the sender's IP address. Our cybersecurity team, which happens to be the best in the world, traced the digital breadcrumbs back to their source, Isla said, her voice as calm and final as a judge's gavel. That IP address is registered to a dedicated private server at a penthouse apartment on Park Avenue, an apartment owned and operated by Sterling Equity Holdings. A collective audible gasp swept through the auditorium. It was the sound of a reputation dying. It was the gunshot in the silent room. Richard felt the world tilt, and go grey at the edges. His suit felt too tight, the air too thin. He was exposed, utterly, completely, and irrevocably. He had been a predator playing in the dark, and she had just turned on the stadium floodlights. Ursula looked directly at him, then across the vast expanse of the room. Her gaze was piercing, unwavering, and devoid of hatred. What he saw in her eyes was far worse. It was pity. It was a profound, dismissive finality. She hadn't just defended her castle, she had turned his own siege weapons against him and leveled his glass house until nothing remained but glittering, pathetic shards. Innovation will always have its enemies, she concluded, turning her attention back to the rapt audience. But the future does not belong to those who try to tear things down. It belongs to those who build. Thank you. She walked off the stage to a deafening, unanimous standing ovation. It wasn't just applause for her company, it was a roar of approval for her character, a celebration of her victory over the petty, bitter man who had tried to ruin her. Richard sat paralyzed, a statue of shame in the center of the room. His phone, which he'd set to silent, began to vibrate against his leg with a frantic, ceaseless intensity. He didn't need to look. He knew who it was. The Singaporean investors, his lawyers, the SEC, the press. He looked up and saw Julian Croft waiting for Isla at the side of the stage. He wasn't smiling triumphantly. He simply handed her a glass of water and watched her with an expression of immense, quiet pride. He hadn't fought her battle for her, he had trusted her, armed her, and given her the space to win her own war. In that searing, clarifying moment, Richard Sterling finally understood the chasm that separated him from a man like Croft. Richard bought things, companies, loyalty, women he saw as beautiful objects. Julian Croft invested in people, and in Isla Vance he had made the investment of a lifetime. Richard, in his blind and bitter arrogance, had made the single worst trade of his entire career, and the bill had just come due in front of the entire world. And there you have it, Richard Sterling, the man who thought he could divest his past like a bad stock, learned the hardest lesson of all: true value isn't something you can buy or sell. It's something you build. Isla didn't need a billionaire to save her. She just needed to be free of the man who was holding her back, and the rest was history. She found a partner who saw her worth, not a man who saw her as a reflection of his own. What did you think of Isla's ultimate comeback? Was Richard's downfall deserved? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. If you were captivated by this story of empowerment and sweet, sweet revenge, please give this video a huge thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs a little inspiration, and most importantly, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Thanks for watching.